Captain Blackwood's weathered hands gripped the ship's wheel as he stared at the woman chained in his quarters. For 20 years he had sailed these treacherous waters, his heart growing colder with each battle fought and each betrayal endured. The sea had claimed everything soft within him, leaving only the hardened shell of a man who knew violence better than tenderness. "I've forgotten what a woman's kiss even tastes like," he confessed to his captive, his voice rough as barnacles on a ship's hull. The admission hung between them, like morning mist over calm waters. She was meant to be leverage, a bargaining chip in his war against her father's merchant fleet. But when she looked at him with those defiant eyes, something stirred in the depths of his forgotten soul. Would one kiss awaken the man he used to be, or would it destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Isabella Hartwell lifted her chin despite the chains that bound her wrists to the heavy oak beam. The locket around her neck caught the flickering candlelight, a small oval of gold containing the only image she had left of her mother. It had been 3 days since the pirates had taken her father's merchant vessel, and still this Captain Blackwood treated her like some fragile ornament rather than the woman she had proven herself to be. "You speak of forgotten kisses, Captain, as if tenderness were some distant shore you can no longer navigate to." Her voice carried the refined accent of London's finest finishing schools, but underneath ran a current of steel that surprised even her. "Perhaps the fault lies not in your memory, but in your choice of companions." Blackwood's grey eyes narrowed. In the lamplight of his cabin, she could see the scars that mapped his weathered face, a thin line along his jaw, a deeper gouge that disappeared into his dark hairline. These were not the marks of a man who had lived gently. "Careful, Miss Hartwell. Your breeding shows when you attempt to wound with words instead of steel, and yours shows when you mistake brutality for strength." She shifted against her bonds, the iron cuffs biting into skin already rubbed raw. "I know who you are, Captain. Thomas Blackwood, formerly of Her Majesty's Navy, the officer who disappeared after the court-martial." Something dangerous flickered in his expression. "That man died 10 years ago, did he? Or did he simply choose to forget what honor tastes like as well?" The silence stretched between them like a taut sail before a storm. Isabella had learned of Blackwood's identity from her father's private correspondence. Edmund Hartwell made it his business to know every pirate who threatened his shipping routes. But she had also learned something else from those letters, something that made her current situation far more complex than a simple kidnapping. Her father had not been entirely honest about the nature of his business ventures. "You were taken because your father's greed has finally exceeded his caution," Blackwood said, moving closer. The floorboards creaked under his boots, and Isabella caught the scent of sea salt and leather that seemed to cling to everything aboard this ship. "Edmund Hartwell thinks his gold can buy him immunity from the consequences of his choices. My father is a respected merchant. His only crime is success." Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Your father traffics in human cargo, Miss Hartwell. The sugar and tobacco that built your comfortable life in London came at the price of souls chained in shipholds just as you are chained now." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. She had suspected something was amiss with her father's business practices, the hushed conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, the ledgers he kept locked away, the strange reluctance to discuss certain trading partners. But to hear it spoken so plainly, to have her worst fears given voice by this pirate of all people. "You lie." "Do I?" Ask yourself why a merchant's daughter was traveling alone to the Caribbean. Ask yourself why your father was so eager to send you away from London, just as Parliament began investigating certain shipping companies. Isabella's throat constricted. She had wondered about the sudden urgency of her father's request that she visit her aunt in Barbados. The explanation about wanting her to oversee some property investments had seemed thin, but she had been too excited by the prospect of adventure to question it deeply. "Even if what you say were true, it changes nothing about what you are. A pirate, a murderer, perhaps, but I have never pretended to be anything else." Blackwood crouched down so that his eyes were level with hers. Up close, she could see flecks of blue in the grey, like glimpses of sky through storm clouds. "Can your father say the same?" The locket at her throat felt suddenly heavy. Her mother had died when Isabella was 12, but not before instilling in her daughter a fierce sense of justice and compassion for those less fortunate. Lady Margaret Hartwell had been known throughout London society for her charitable works, her advocacy for the poor and downtrodden. What would her mother think of the truth Isabella was beginning to piece together? "Why tell me this?" she asked quietly. "What purpose does it serve to destroy my faith in the man who raised me? Because faith built on lies is no faith at all." Blackwood stood, his shadow falling across her like a dark sail. "And because tomorrow you will have to choose between the comfortable illusions of your past and the harsh truths of your future." He moved toward the cabin door, then paused with his hand on the brass handle. The cutlass hung from Blackwood's belt like a familiar weight, its worn leather grip molded to his hand by years of use. Along the blade's fuller, tiny scratches spelled out names: Jenkins, Martinez, O'Brien, Crawford, each mark a memorial to crew members who had fallen under his command. He traced one of the names with his thumb as he stood at the stern rail, watching the moonlight dance across the Caribbean waters. 20 years ago he had been Lieutenant Commander Thomas Blackwood of Her Majesty's Navy, a man who believed in honor, duty, and the righteousness of England's cause. That man had worn a crisp blue uniform and carried a ceremonial sword that had never tasted blood in anger. That man had been a fool. The betrayal had come from within, as the worst betrayals always do. Admiral Pembroke, his mentor and father figure, had been selling naval intelligence to French privateers for 3 years. When Blackwood discovered the treachery, he had done what any honorable officer would do. He had reported it through proper channels, trusting in the system he had sworn to serve. Instead of justice, he had found himself charged with the very crimes he had tried to expose. Pembroke's connections ran deep through the Admiralty, and a young lieutenant commander's word meant little against a decorated admiral's reputation. The court-martial had been a foregone conclusion, the evidence carefully fabricated, the witnesses either bought or intimidated into silence. But it was the massacre that truly broke him. HMS Retribution had been his first independent command, a frigate tasked with protecting merchant vessels from pirate attacks. He had taken pride in his crew, in their loyalty and professionalism. They had trusted him to lead them safely through dangerous waters, and he had failed them utterly. The French privateers had known exactly where to find them, exactly when the ship would be most vulnerable. Pembroke's intelligence had been thorough. In the space of an hour, 2/3 of Blackwood's crew lay dead on blood-soaked decks. The survivors, including Blackwood himself, had been left to drift in a damaged ship as a message to any other officers who might consider challenging the established order. Torres had been his first mate then, a young Spanish sailor who had somehow managed to keep the damaged ship afloat long enough for rescue. They had both been invalided out of service, Torres with a shattered leg that would never heal properly, Blackwood with wounds that went deeper than flesh. "Captain?" Torres' voice interrupted his brooding. The first mate approached with the careful gait of a man whose leg pained him constantly, but who had learned never to complain. "The lads are asking about the prisoner. Some of them think we should ransom her quickly and be done with it." Blackwood turned from the rail. Torres was one of the few men who had followed him into piracy, loyalty binding them together through years of violence and survival. The Spaniard understood better than most the weight of command, the burden of making choices that would determine who lived and who died. "And what do you think, old friend?" Torres was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think she troubles you in ways that have nothing to do with ransom money, and I think that could be dangerous for all of us." It was true, though. Blackwood was reluctant to admit it even to himself. Something about Isabella Hartwell reminded him of the man he had once been, the idealistic officer who had believed the world could be made better through honor and justice. Her defiance in the face of captivity, her refusal to be cowed by circumstances beyond her control, it stirred memories he had thought safely buried. "She knows about her father's business," Blackwood said, "or she's beginning to suspect. Then she'll hate him for it, and love you for opening her eyes." Torres shook his head. You're playing with fire, Thomas. The crew follows you because you're cold, calculating and absolutely ruthless when circumstances require it. They won't follow a man who's been softened by a pretty face and a tragic story. Blackwood's hand instinctively moved to his cutlass grip. Are you questioning my judgment? I'm questioning your heart. It's been frozen solid for 10 years, and now suddenly it's thawed. That kind of change can crack a man in half. The truth of it stung because Torres was right. For a decade, Blackwood had survived by feeling nothing, by treating every decision as a tactical problem to be solved rather than a moral choice to be weighed. He had become the phantom, a ghost who struck without warning and disappeared without remorse. But Isabella Hartwell had looked at him with those green eyes and seen not the legendary pirate captain, but the broken naval officer underneath. She had spoken to him as if he was still a man worth saving, and that recognition had awakened something he thought he had killed long ago. The crew needs to believe in something more than just gold and survival, he said finally. They need to believe their captain knows the difference between justice and revenge. And do you know the difference? Blackwood considered the question as he watched the stars wheel overhead. Justice was what he had sought 20 years ago when he reported Pembroke's crimes. Revenge was what he had taken when he finally hunted down the admiral and put a bullet through his treacherous heart. But what he felt now, looking at Isabella Hartwell and seeing the reflection of his younger, more hopeful self, what was that? I'm beginning to remember, he said. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, Miss Hartwell. Do not let your father's sins diminish her legacy. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Isabella alone with her chains and her doubts, and the terrible certainty that nothing would ever be simple again. Isabella's fingers traced the leather binding of the small journal she had managed to conceal in her corset before the pirates boarded her father's ship. The diary contained more than just a young woman's private thoughts, hidden between seemingly innocent observations about London society, and her journey to the Caribbean were carefully coded notes about her father's business dealings. She had begun keeping these records 3 months ago, after overhearing a conversation that had shattered her understanding of the man who had raised her. Edmund Hartwell had been meeting with a representative from the Royal African Company, discussing shipping manifests and cargo capacities in terms that made Isabella's blood run cold. When she heard them refer to units of human merchandise and acceptable mortality rates during transport, she had finally understood the source of their family's vast wealth. The realization had come gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape she had never truly seen before. The Hartwell estates in London, the country house in Surrey, her expensive education and elaborate wardrobe, all of it built on the suffering of people torn from their homes and families, crammed into shipholds like cargo, bought and sold like livestock. She had confronted her father the very next day, entering his study with righteous fury burning in her chest. Edmund Hartwell had been reviewing ledgers at his massive mahogany desk, the same desk where he had helped her with her arithmetic lessons as a child. I know what you do, she had said without preamble. I know about the ships, about the cargo you transport from Africa. Her father had looked up from his papers with the patient expression he usually reserved for her more dramatic pronouncements. Isabella, my dear, I'm afraid I don't understand what you're suggesting. Don't patronize me. I heard you speaking with Mr. Blackwell from the African Company. I heard you discussing people as if they were bolts of cloth or barrels of rum. The change in her father's demeanor had been subtle but unmistakable. The indulgent smile faded, replaced by something harder and more calculating. You were eavesdropping on a private business conversation. That's most unlike you. What's unlike me is discovering that my father profits from human misery. How long, Papa? How long have you been involved in the slave trade? Edmund had set down his pen with deliberate care. Since before you were born, if you must know. The sugar plantations in the Caribbean require workers. Isabella, the economic prosperity of the empire depends on maintaining that labor force. Those workers are people, human beings with families, with hopes and dreams, just like ours. They are Africans, Isabella. Their circumstances in their homeland are often far worse than what they find in the New World. In many ways, we are providing them with opportunities they would never have otherwise. The calm rationalization had been worse than anger. Her father truly believed his own justifications, had convinced himself that slavery was a form of benevolence rather than brutality. Isabella had stared at this man who had taught her to read, who had dried her tears when her mother died, who had filled her nursery with books and toys and love, and realized she was looking at a stranger. "Mama would be horrified," she had whispered. That had finally cracked Edmund's composure. "Your mother understood the necessities of maintaining our position in society. She may not have involved herself directly in business matters, but she certainly enjoyed the benefits of our success. She died believing you were an honorable man. I am an honorable man. I fulfill my contracts. I pay my debts. I provide for my family. The world is not the nursery tale you seem to think it is. Isabella, it is brutal and unforgiving, and those who prosper are those who understand that sentiment and morality are luxuries we can ill afford." She had left his study that day feeling as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Everything she had believed about her family, about her place in the world, had been revealed as a comfortable lie. The charitable work she had done, the donations to orphanages and hospitals that had made her feel virtuous, all of it was paid for with blood money. Now chained in Captain Blackwood's cabin, she understood why her father had been so eager to send her away from London. Parliament was indeed investigating certain trading companies, and the Hartwell name was likely to surface in those inquiries. Her exile to the Caribbean had been meant to protect her from the scandal, to keep her safely distant from the consequences of his choices. But there was bitter irony in her current situation. She had been captured by pirates while fleeing the revelation of her father's criminality, only to discover that her captors might be the more honorable men. Blackwood had looked her in the eye when he told her the truth about Edmund Hartwell's business. Her father had spent her entire life constructing elaborate deceptions to hide it. The door to the cabin opened, interrupting her brooding. A young sailor entered carrying a tray of food, bread, cheese, and water in a pewter cup. He moved nervously, clearly uncomfortable with his assignment. "The captain says you're to eat," he mumbled, setting the tray within her reach. "What's your name?" Isabella asked gently. "Billy, Miss Billy Hawkins." "How long have you been with Captain Blackwood, Billy?" The boy, he couldn't have been more than 16, glanced toward the door, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Near 2 years now, miss, since my merchant ship was taken, and he forced you to join his crew." Billy shook his head quickly. "No, miss. Captain gave us all a choice. Said we could join up willing-like, or he'd put us ashore at the next port with enough coin to make our way home. Most of the lads chose to stay." "Why?" "Because he treats us fair, miss. Better than my old captain ever did. Shares the prizes equal, don't beat us for small mistakes. Make sure we all know our letters and numbers." Billy's voice dropped to a whisper. "And he don't truck with slaving ships. Won't take a penny from that trade, no matter how much gold's involved." After Billy left, Isabella stared at the simple meal and considered the strange world she found herself in. Her father, the respected London merchant, profited from human bondage while maintaining a facade of respectability. Her captor, the notorious pirate, refused to participate in the very trade that had made her family rich. She began to eat, wondering if honor was perhaps more complex than she had ever imagined. The pewter bowl sat between them on the rough wooden table, half filled with a simple stew that smelled of salt pork and root vegetables. Blackwood had dismissed the usual practice of having crew members deliver the prisoners' meals, choosing instead to bring her food himself. He told himself it was merely practical, an opportunity to gauge her state of mind, to assess whether she was becoming compliant or plotting some form of resistance. But the truth was more complicated. "You're not eating," he observed, settling into the chair across from her. The cabin felt smaller when he was present, his broad shoulders and commanding presence filling the space in ways that made Isabella acutely aware of their proximity. "Forgive me if my appetite suffers while chained like an animal," she replied, though her tone lacked the sharp edge it had carried in previous encounters. The revelations about her father had drained much of the fight from her, leaving behind a weary resignation that Blackwood found oddly troubling. "The chains are for the crew's peace of mind, not mine," he said, producing a small key from his waistcoat pocket. "I suspect you're more dangerous with words than with weapons." He leaned forward to unlock the manacles around her wrists, and Isabella caught a glimpse of something unexpected, a thin chain around his neck, partially hidden beneath his shirt. The brief contact as he worked the lock sent an unexpected jolt through her, skin touching skin for the first time since her capture. Blackwood felt it too, that spark of human connection that had been absent from his life for so long. His hands stilled for a moment, the key forgotten as he found himself studying the delicate bones of her wrist, the pale skin marked by the iron cuffs. When had he last touched another person with gentleness rather than violence? "There," he said, sitting back quickly and pocketing the key. "Perhaps now you'll find the meal more palatable." Isabella rubbed her freed wrists, working circulation back into her hands. The simple act of being unbound felt like a tremendous gift, though she suspected it was temporary. "Why?" she asked. "Your crew expects you to keep me secured. My crew expects me to make decisions that benefit all of us. Sometimes that requires methods they don't immediately understand." She picked up the spoon and tasted the stew, surprised to find it well seasoned and warming. "Did you cook this yourself, Captain?" "I've learned many skills over the years that weren't part of my naval training, cooking among them." He gestured to the bowl. "A hungry crew is a mutinous crew, and finding decent cooks willing to join a pirate ship is more challenging than you might imagine." Despite herself, Isabella found the corner of her mouth quirking upward. "I'm trying to picture the fearsome Captain Blackwood peeling potatoes and seasoning soup. The fearsome Captain Blackwood does whatever is necessary to keep his men alive and loyal. If that requires him to learn the mysteries of proper seasoning, so be it." They ate in companionable silence for several minutes, and Isabella marveled at how different this felt from their previous interactions. The verbal sparring had given way to something approaching normalcy, as if they were simply two people sharing a meal rather than captor and prisoner. "Tell me about your mother," Blackwood said suddenly. The request caught her off guard. "What?" "Because you mentioned she would be horrified by your father's business practices. Because when you speak of her, your entire demeanor changes. Because I suspect she was the source of whatever moral compass guides you now." Isabella set down her spoon, considering whether to answer. Something in Blackwood's tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than tactical questioning. "She was extraordinary," Isabella said finally. "Beautiful, yes, but more than that, she had a way of seeing the best in everyone, of making people want to be better than they were. She spent her days visiting workhouses and hospitals, reading to children who had never owned a book, bringing food to families who had nothing. And your father supported this. He indulged it. I don't think he understood why she cared so deeply about people she had never met, people who could offer her nothing in return. But he loved her enough to let her follow her conscience." Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "She sounds like a woman of rare character. When she died, I promised myself I would continue her work, that I would use our family's advantages to help those who had been given fewer opportunities." Isabella's voice turned bitter. "How naive I was. All those years of charitable works, and I never once questioned where the money came from. You were a child. Children trust their parents to be honorable. Were you honorable? I mean before." She gestured vaguely, encompassing his current circumstances without explicitly naming them. "I believed I was. I served king and country, protected merchant vessels from pirates." He paused, the irony not lost on him. "I suppose fate has a sense of humor. What changed you?" Blackwood considered how much to reveal. This woman had already seen more of his true self than anyone had in years, and he found himself wanting to tell her everything about Pembroke's betrayal, about the massacre that had killed most of his crew, about the long years of hardening his heart against any possibility of trust or tenderness. "I learned that honor is a luxury that few can afford," he said instead, "and that sometimes survival requires abandoning the very principles we once held dear." Isabella reached across the table without thinking, her fingers brushing against his hand where it rested beside the bowl. The contact was brief, instinctive, but it sent another shock through both of them. "I'm sorry," she said, though whether she was apologizing for the touch or for whatever pain had driven him to piracy, she wasn't sure. Blackwood stared down at his hand, where she had touched it, marveling at how such a simple gesture could affect him so profoundly. When had anyone last offered him sympathy? When had anyone last seen him as deserving of comfort rather than fear? "We should return you to your bonds," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The crew will expect. Must we? I give you my word. I won't attempt to escape or cause trouble." The word of a merchant's daughter, the word of Margaret Hartwell's daughter. Something in the way she said it, the quiet dignity and resolve in her voice, made Blackwood's decision for him. "Very well, but if you betray my trust, I won't." They finished their meal in silence, both acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted between them, though neither was prepared to name what that something might be. Torres held his brass compass in weathered hands, watching the needle swing toward magnetic north with the reliability that had guided ships safely through countless storms. The instrument had been a gift from his mother when he first joined the Spanish Navy as a boy of 14, and it had never failed him in 30 years of sailing, unlike his captain's moral compass, which seemed to be spinning wildly these days. "She's trouble, Thomas," Torres said, approaching Blackwood at the ship's bow where the captain stood staring out at the endless expanse of Caribbean blue. "The men are talking." Blackwood didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed slightly. "What are they saying?" "That you're spending too much time with the prisoner. That you're going soft. Hendricks is making noises about your judgment being compromised." Now Blackwood did turn, his grey eyes flashing with the cold fury that had made him legendary among both pirates and naval officers. "Hendricks questions my judgment. He questions your priorities. As do I." Torres limped closer, his damaged leg making his gait uneven, but his resolve steady. "In 10 years of sailing together, I've never seen you hesitate to make the hard choices. Now suddenly you're playing nursemaid to a merchant's daughter, and acting like her comfort matters more than crew morale. Her comfort has nothing to do with it. Then what does? Because from where I stand it looks like Captain Thomas Blackwood is remembering what it felt like to be Lieutenant Commander Thomas Blackwood. And that's a dangerous thing for all of us." The accusation hung in the salt air between them like cannon smoke. Torres was the only man aboard who could speak to Blackwood with such directness, their friendship forged in the crucible of betrayal and survival. But even that history had its limits. "Watch your tongue, old friend. You forget yourself." "No, I forget nothing. I remember the naive officer who trusted his superior's honor and nearly got us all killed because of it. I remember the broken man who could barely function for months afterward. And I remember the moment you finally decided to stop being a victim and start being a predator instead." Torres pointed toward Blackwood's cabin with his compass. "That woman in there represents everything that made you weak before. Honor, nobility, the belief that people can be better than their circumstance. You let those feelings back in, and you'll make the same mistakes that cost us half our crew 20 years ago. Isabella Hartwell is not Admiral Pembroke. No, she's worse. Pembroke was obviously corrupt, a snake you could see coming. This girl is making you want to be good again, and that's more dangerous than any external enemy." Below decks they could hear the crew going about their duties, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been present before Isabella's arrival. Men clustered in small groups, their conversations dropping to whispers when officers passed. The easy camaraderie that had defined the Crimson Tide's crew was fraying. "Hendricks isn't the only one with concerns," Torres continued. "Morrison thinks we should ransom her quickly and move on. Peters wants to know why we're wasting water and provisions on someone who isn't contributing to the ship's work. And Jackson." Torres paused, meeting Blackwood's eyes directly. "Jackson thinks we should sell her to the slavers at Tortuga and be done with it." "Jackson knows my position on slaving. Jackson knows your old position. He's not sure about your current one, especially since you seem more interested in having philosophical discussions with the prisoner than in planning our next prize." The truth of it stung, because Torres wasn't entirely wrong. Blackwood had found himself distracted by thoughts of Isabella, replaying their conversations, wondering about her opinions on matters that should have been irrelevant to a pirate captain's concerns. When had he last spent so much mental energy on anything other than survival and profit? The crew follows me because I've kept them alive and wealthy for 10 years. Blackwood said, not because they understand every decision I make. They follow you because you're strong, decisive, and absolutely ruthless when the situation requires it. They don't follow men who second-guess themselves or who develop attachments that compromise their judgment. You think I'm compromised? Torres was quiet for a long moment, studying his captain's face with the eye of someone who had known him through triumph and disaster. I think you're remembering what it felt like to care about someone other than yourself, and that scares the hell out of you, which means it should scare the hell out of the rest of us too. A shout from the crow's nest interrupted their conversation. Sail ho! 2 points off the starboard bow. Blackwood snatched the spyglass from his belt and extended it, scanning the horizon until he found the distant ship. Even at this distance, he could make out the clean lines of a naval frigate, her sails full and her course steady. British? Torres asked. French, I think, one of their patrol ships. Blackwood collapsed the spyglass. They're too far away to be a threat, but we should alter course to avoid any possibility of engagement. Or we could take her. French frigates often carry gold meant for colonial governors. Could be a profitable encounter. It was exactly the kind of opportunity Blackwood would have seized without hesitation just a week ago. A chance to increase their wealth while striking a blow against one of England's enemies. The old Thomas Blackwood would have already been shouting orders to prepare for battle. Instead, he found himself thinking about Isabella, about what might happen to her if the engagement went badly, about whether she would be safer if they simply avoided the confrontation altogether. We'll change course, he said. No point in unnecessary risks. Torres stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. God help us all, he muttered. She really has gotten to you. As Blackwood gave orders to adjust their heading, he tried to tell himself that his decision was based on sound tactical reasoning rather than concern for his prisoner's welfare. But deep down, he knew Torres was right. Isabella Hartwell was changing him, awakening parts of his personality that had been dormant for years. The question was whether that change would make him a better man or simply a weaker captain, and whether his crew would give him time to find out. The brass ship's bell swung wildly as the crimson tide pitched and rolled through mountainous waves, its bronze surface bearing a spider web of cracks from years of service. The storm had appeared on the horizon like God's own fury, transforming the placid Caribbean into a cauldron of wind and water that threatened to tear the ship apart, plank by plank. Blackwood burst into his cabin, salt water streaming from his coat and hair, his boots squelching on the wooden floor. Isabella looked up from where she sat, braced against the bulkhead, her chains rattling with each violent movement of the ship. The storm's getting worse, he said, producing the key to her manacles. I need to get you topside. What? Isabella struggled to maintain her balance as the cabin tilted at an impossible angle. Why would you take me into that? Because if we found her, you'll drown chained in here like a rat in a trap. His hands worked quickly at the locks, his touch impersonal but urgent. At least on deck you'll have a chance. The door burst open and Torres stumbled in, his face pale with exhaustion. Thomas, the mainmast's taking too much strain. We need every able body on deck to secure the rigging, or we're going to lose her. Take the lady to the quarterdeck and lash her to the mizzenmast. Blackwood ordered. Keep her as far from the worst of it as possible. Captain, with respect, we don't have time to nursemaid prisoners. Every man needs to be working to save this ship. Isabella stood on unsteady legs, her freed hands gripping whatever solid surfaces she could find. I can help, she said, surprising both men. I've sailed before. I know ships. You've been a passenger on merchant vessels, Blackwood said dismissively. This is different. This is survival, and I refuse to be deadweight. Isabella's green eyes blazed with determination, despite her fear. I can tie knots, I can follow orders, and I can work as hard as any of your men. Use me. Another massive wave struck the ship, sending all three of them stumbling. Through the cabin's windows, Isabella could see water washing over the deck, and she realized with cold clarity that they were fighting for their lives. Blackwood studied her face for a heartbeat, then nodded curtly. "Stay close to Torres. Do exactly what he tells you, when he tells you. If you're swept overboard, we won't be able to rescue you." The next hour passed in a blur of desperate activity. Isabella found herself hauling on ropes with hands that quickly became raw and bleeding, her silk dress torn and soaked through within minutes of reaching the deck. The crew, initially skeptical of having a woman among them during such a crisis, quickly accepted her help. As the storm's fury intensified, she worked alongside Billy Hawkins to secure loose cargo, their combined weight barely enough to drag the heavy crates to safety before they could be swept away by the next wave. When the forward sail tore free in the wind, she scrambled up the rigging without being asked, her fingers nimble with the knots, despite the rain making everything slippery. "Mind the boom!" Torres shouted over the howling wind, and Isabella ducked just as a massive piece of timber swung past her head. She grabbed the nearest rope and helped two crew members wrestle the sail back under control, her muscles screaming with effort. Blackwood appeared beside her, his powerful frame moving with practiced efficiency, even in the chaotic conditions. "You're bleeding," he said, noticing her torn hands. "So are you," she replied, nodding at the gash across his forehead, where flying debris had caught him. They worked side by side, their earlier tensions forgotten in the face of immediate peril. When a section of rigging came loose, threatening to bring down the foremast, Isabella was there to help him secure it. When she slipped on the wet deck, his strong hands caught her before she could fall. The intimacy of shared danger created a bond between them that neither had expected. Each time one of them was in peril, the other was there, not because duty demanded it, but because the thought of loss had become unbearable. "Man overboard!" The cry came from somewhere forward, barely audible over the storm's roar. Isabella saw Peterson, one of the younger crew members, struggling in the churning water beside the ship. Without thinking, she grabbed a coil of rope and began tying it around her waist. "What are you doing?" Blackwood caught her arm. "He's drowning. You'll both drown if you go in there." But Isabella had already secured the rope and was climbing over the rail. "Then don't let me." She plunged into the icy water before he could stop her. The sea tried to claim her immediately, dragging her down into its dark embrace. But her childhood summers spent swimming in the estate's lake had made her strong in the water, and she fought her way to Peterson's side. The young man was barely conscious, blood streaming from a head wound where debris had struck him. "Hold on to me," she shouted, wrapping her arm around his chest and signaling to the crew above. Blackwood and three other men hauled them both back aboard, their faces grim with the knowledge of how close they had come to losing them both. Peterson would live, thanks to Isabella's quick action and disregard for her own safety. As the storm finally began to subside near dawn, Isabella found herself sitting on a coil of rope, her entire body aching with exhaustion. The crew looked at her differently now, not as a prisoner or a burden, but as someone who had proven herself when it mattered most. Blackwood approached with a flask of rum and a clean cloth for her bleeding hands. "That was foolishly brave," he said quietly. "Peterson has a wife and children waiting for him in Portsmouth." Isabella replied, "I couldn't let him die when I had the power to save him." "You risked your life for a man you barely know. Isn't that what decent people do?" Blackwood knelt beside her and began gently cleaning the cuts on her palms. His touch was surprisingly tender for such powerful hands, and Isabella found herself studying his face in the pale morning light. The storm had washed away the last of his careful reserve, leaving behind something raw and honest. "Your mother would be proud," he said softly. "I hope so." Isabella winced as he wrapped her hands with strips torn from a clean shirt. Tom. It was the first time she had used his given name, and it sent an unexpected thrill through him. "Yes, thank you for trusting me, for letting me help instead of treating me like cargo." Blackwood tied off the bandages and sat back on his heel. Around them, the crew was beginning the work of assessing damage and making repairs, but for this moment, they existed in a small pocket of quiet intimacy. "You saved Peterson's life," he said. "The crew won't forget that. Neither will I." The cracked bell continued to ring softly in the gentle breeze that had replaced the storm's fury, its damaged bronze voice, somehow more beautiful for having survived the tempest. Like the ship itself, it had been tested and had endured. Like the bond growing between them, Isabella thought, fragile but stronger than either of them had dared to hope. The torn silk of Isabella's dress caught the lamplight as she attempted to mend it with needle and thread borrowed from the ship's stores. 3 days had passed since the storm, and the fabric bore witness to her transformation from pampered merchant's daughter to someone who had earned her place among pirates through courage and determination. Blackwood entered his cabin quietly, carrying a bottle of wine and 2 pewter cups. The evening air was still and warm, a stark contrast to the violence they had weathered together. Isabella looked up from her sewing, and he was struck by how the harsh realities of shipboard life had changed her. Her hands bore the calluses of honest work, her skin was bronzed by sun and salt air, and her eyes held a depth of experience that hadn't been there before. "I thought you might appreciate something better than rum tonight," he said, settling into the chair across from hers. Isabella set aside her mending and accepted the offered cup. The wine was French, probably taken from some merchant vessel in months past, but it tasted like civilization after days of ship's rations and rough spirits. "Peterson asked me to thank you again," Blackwood said. "He's writing a letter to his wife, her about the woman who saved his life. He would have done the same for me, I'm certain. Would he? Most men talk about honor and sacrifice, but precious few are willing to risk themselves for strangers when the moment arrives." Isabella sipped her wine thoughtfully. Perhaps most men haven't been given the opportunity to discover what they're truly capable of. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the only sounds the gentle creaking of the ship and the distant murmur of crew voices on deck. The tension that had marked their earlier encounters had evolved into something else, not quite friendship, but a mutual recognition of worth that transcended their circumstances. "Tell me about your life before," Isabella said suddenly. "Before the betrayal, before piracy. Who were you when you believed the world was a just place?" Blackwood's hand tightened slightly on his cup. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I've seen glimpses of that man in the past few days. When you trusted me during the storm, when you've spoken about honor and justice. He's still there, isn't he? The officer who believed in doing what was right. That man was naive. He trusted too easily and suffered for it. Or perhaps he simply trusted the wrong people." Isabella leaned forward, her green eyes serious. "There's a difference between being betrayed and being naive, Thomas. One is a failure of judgment. The other is simply misfortune." The use of his first name still sent a jolt through him, but this time he didn't flinch away from the intimacy it implied. "You sound very certain for someone who recently discovered her own father's duplicity, which is exactly why I understand the distinction. My father chose to deceive me, to build my entire worldview on lies and half-truths. But that doesn't make me foolish for loving him or believing in the goodness I thought I saw. It makes him cruel for exploiting that trust." Blackwood studied her face in the lamplight. "And what of your trust in me? Isn't that equally misplaced? I'm a pirate, Isabella. I've killed men, stolen their ships, taken their gold. I'm exactly the sort of person your mother would have warned you about. Are you?" Isabella set down her wine and moved closer to him, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because the man I've come to know these past few days doesn't match that description. The man who unlocks my chains so we can share a meal, who risks his crew's loyalty to protect my safety, who speaks of honor as if it still matters to him. That man seems worthy of trust. You see what you want to see. No, I see what you're afraid to acknowledge about yourself." She reached out tentatively, her fingertips brushing against the back of his hand. "You're not the same man who was betrayed 20 years ago, Thomas. But you're not the monster you've convinced yourself you became either." The touch of her fingers against his skin was electric, Blackwood found himself studying her face, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way her lips parted slightly when she was thinking deeply. When had he last looked at a woman with anything other than casual desire? When had he last felt this trembling awareness, this sense that the next few moments would change everything? "Isabella," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "you should be careful. I'm not the kind of man who can offer you the life you deserve. What if the life I deserve isn't the life I want?" She was close enough now that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that somehow still clung to her hair, despite their recent trials. Close enough that he could see the golden flecks in her green eyes, the subtle pulse at the base of her throat. "What do you want?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would destroy what little remained of his carefully constructed defenses. Instead of replying with words, Isabella closed the remaining distance between them. Her lips found his with a softness that made his breath catch, a gentle exploration that quickly deepened into something more urgent and desperate. The kiss tasted of wine and possibility, of everything he had forgotten during his years of self-imposed isolation. It was tentative at first, then bolder as Isabella's arms came up to circle his neck, her fingers threading through his dark hair. Blackwood felt the last of his resistance crumble. 20 years of careful emotional armor fell away in the space of heartbeats, leaving him vulnerable and raw, and more alive than he had felt since his world had first been shattered by betrayal. This kiss was nothing like the mechanical encounters he had occasionally indulged in over the years. It was a meeting of souls as much as bodies, a recognition of something precious and rare. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Isabella's cheeks were flushed, her lips slightly swollen from their kiss, and Blackwood thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. "Now I remember," he said softly, his forehead resting against hers. "Remember what? What a woman's kiss tastes like." His thumb traced gently along her jawline. "It tastes like coming home." Isabella's smile was radiant and sad at the same time. "And what do we do now that you remember?" It was the question that would define everything that came after, and they both knew it. In kissing her, Blackwood had acknowledged feelings he had spent years suppressing. In kissing him back, Isabella had chosen her path as surely as if she had signed her name to a contract written in her own blood. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I can't pretend it didn't happen. I can't pretend you don't matter to me." "Then don't pretend." Isabella's hand covered his where it rested against her cheek. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it honestly." Outside, the ship sailed on through the Caribbean night, carrying them toward an uncertain future that suddenly seemed full of impossible possibilities. The knife lay on Jackson's bunk, its blade freshly sharpened and gleaming in the dim light of the crew's quarters. He had been honing the edge for an hour, the rhythmic scrape of steel against whetstone serving as counterpoint to the whispered conversations that filled the space between decks. The weapon had served him well in a dozen boarding actions, but tonight it might serve a different purpose entirely. "He's lost his mind," Hendricks muttered, his voice low but carrying clearly in the cramped quarters. 3 days ago, he lets the prisoner work alongside us like she's crew. Last night Morrison saw her leaving the captain's cabin at dawn, her dress all torn and her hair loose. Jackson set down his whetstone and tested the blade's edge with his thumb. A thin line of blood welled up where the steel bit into skin. "Captain's business is captain's business," he said carefully. "Not when it affects the rest of us," Peters chimed in from his hammock. "Half the lads are talking about what happens when her father comes looking for her. The other half are wondering if Blackwood's planning to keep her permanent-like. And what's wrong with that?" Billy Hawkins asked from the corner where he was mending sail. "She saved Peterson's life. Worked harder than most of us during the storm. Seems to me she's earned her place." "Her place?" Hendricks laughed harshly. "Boy, she's gentry, born to silk and servants and fine houses. You think she's going to spend the rest of her life sleeping on canvas and eating hardtack? First chance she gets, she'll run back to her comfortable world and leave us all to hang." The argument that followed was one that had been brewing for days, ever since Isabella had proven herself during the storm. The crew was divided between those who had come to respect her courage and those who saw her as a dangerous distraction to their captain's judgment. Jackson listened with growing unease. He had sailed with Blackwood for 8 years, through battles and storms and lean times when they had been forced to survive on raw cunning alone. The captain had never wavered before, never allowed personal feelings to compromise his decision-making. But the change in him since taking the Hartwell girl was undeniable. "Mark my words," Hendricks continued, his voice taking on the fervor of a preacher condemning sin. "That woman will be the death of us all. She's made him soft, turned him into some lovesick fool who cares more about her comfort than our survival." "Captain Blackwood has never been soft," Torres said quietly from the doorway. None of them had heard him approach, and his sudden appearance sent a chill through the gathered men. The first mate's weathered face was impassive, but his dark eyes held a warning that made even Hendricks fall silent. "Just discussing ship's business," Jackson said, sliding his knife into its sheath. "I heard what you were discussing." Torres entered the quarters fully, his damaged leg making his gait careful but determined. "And I'm here to remind you all that questioning the captain's judgment is a dangerous habit to develop." "With respect, sir," Peters said, "we've got a right to our concern. This ain't just about the captain anymore. That girl's presence affects all of us." "Does it? How exactly has Miss Hartwell's presence harmed any of you?" "She's worked alongside you, bled alongside you, risked her life to save one of your shipmates. What more does she need to do to earn your acceptance?" Hendricks found his courage again. "She needs to not be filling the captain's head with romantic nonsense. She needs to not be making him second-guess every tactical decision. She needs to not be turning him back into the kind of honorable fool who got half our crew killed 20 years ago." The silence that followed was profound. Torres studied each man's face in turn, reading the mix of loyalty and doubt that divided them. "Let me tell you something about honor," Torres said finally. "I've sailed with Thomas Blackwood through the worst betrayal a man can suffer. I've watched him build himself back from nothing into the most feared captain in these waters, and I've never seen him happier than he's been these past few days." "Happy don't keep us alive," Jackson observed. "Neither does misery. You think a captain consumed bitterness and rage makes better decisions than one who remembers what he's fighting for?" Torres shook his head. "I was the one warning him about getting too close to her. But after watching them together, after seeing how she brings out the best parts of the man he used to be, I'm wondering if maybe that's exactly what he needs. And if it gets us all killed," Hendricks demanded, "then we die following the only captain worth following. But I don't think it will come to that." Torres turned toward the door, then paused. "The woman chose to stay with us during the storm when she could have let Peterson drown and possibly escaped in the confusion. She chose to work beside us, to bleed beside us, to earn her place through deeds rather than words. Maybe it's time you asked yourselves why you're so determined not to let her." After Torres left, the crew quarters fell into an uneasy quiet. Jackson fingered the hilt of his knife, thinking about loyalty and leadership and the fine line between the two. "He's got a point," Billy said eventually. "About Miss Isabella, I mean. She ain't done nothing but prove herself since she's been here." "Today, maybe," Hendricks replied. "But what about tomorrow? What about when we take our next prize and she sees us for what we really are? What about when her father comes with enough gold to buy her freedom and enough ships to destroy us all?" The questions hung in the air like smoke from the ship's galley fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Jackson knew that whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of Isabella Hartwell, but the very soul of the crew that had followed Blackwood through years of danger and triumph. Above them, footsteps crossed the deck as the night watch took their positions. Somewhere in the captain's cabin, Blackwood and Isabella were discovering what it meant to care for another person after years of careful isolation. But here below decks, older loyalties were being tested against new realities, and Jackson wasn't sure which would prove stronger. He pulled out his knife again and resumed sharpening it, the steady scrape of steel against stone, a meditation on the violence that seemed to follow them wherever they sailed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities for both redemption and betrayal. Jackson only hoped they would all survive whatever came next. The shipping ledgers lay spread across Blackwood's table like evidence in a court of law, their pages filled with neat columns of numbers that told a story Isabella had never wanted to read. Hartwell Trading Company manifests from the past 5 years, captured during raids on her father's vessels, documented the systematic transportation of human cargo with the same clinical precision used to record barrels of rum or bolts of cloth. Batch 3047 80 units acquired Gold Coast, destination Kingston. Expected mortality 15%. Isabella's voice barely rose above a whisper as she read aloud from her father's own handwriting. Unit losses during transport 23. Profit margin 340%. Blackwood watched her face as the full scope of Edmund Hartwell's involvement became clear. He had dreaded this moment, knowing that destroying someone's faith in their parent was a form of cruelty he had never wanted to inflict. But Isabella had insisted on seeing the evidence, and he had learned that she possessed a strength that demanded truth over comfortable lies. Units, she repeated, the words seeming to stick in her throat. He called them units, human beings reduced to inventory numbers. It's easier that way, Blackwood said quietly. If you never acknowledge their humanity, you never have to confront what you're taking from them. Isabella turned the page, her hands trembling slightly. The next manifest was more recent, dated just 4 months ago. Batch 402, 209 units acquired Benin. Special cargo, 15 children under age 12. Premium pricing negotiated for young stock. She stood abruptly, walking to the cabin's small porthole, as if she needed air. The documents continued to sprawl across the table behind her. An accusation written in her father's own hand. I used to wonder why he kept his business ledgers locked away, she said, her voice hollow, why he would never discuss his trading routes in detail, why he became so uncomfortable whenever I asked about the source of our prosperity. I thought perhaps he was simply being protective of trade secrets. Children often see the best in their parents, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Evidence. Isabella laughed bitterly. There was always evidence, wasn't there? The way certain business associates would lower their voices when I entered the room. The letters that arrived with foreign postmarks that he would burn after reading. The fact that our wealth seemed to grow so dramatically during periods when other merchants were struggling. She returned to the table, forcing herself to continue reading. Each page revealed new horrors documented with bureaucratic efficiency. Mortality rates tracked like shipping cost cargo manifests that listed men, women and children alongside barrels of molasses and sacks of sugar. Insurance claims for damaged goods that made Isabella's stomach turn. Here, she said, pointing to a particular entry with a shaking finger. A manifest from my 18th birthday, while I was celebrating with cake and presents in our London drawing room. Father was documenting the arrival of 90 enslaved souls in Port Royal. The dates match exactly. Blackwood moved to stand beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to intrude on her grief. I'm sorry you had to learn this way. Are you? Or are you pleased to see Edmund Hartwell's daughter confronted with her family's sins? The question was harsh but fair. Blackwood considered his motivations carefully before responding. I wanted you to understand why I could never simply ransom you back to him. Why the thought of returning you to a life built on such suffering makes my conscience rebel, but I take no pleasure in your pain. Isabella, none at all. She picked up another document, this one bearing the seal of the Royal African Company. A contract granting Hartwell Trading Company exclusive rights to transport human cargo from 3 African ports. Signed and witnessed, perfectly legal under English law. Legal and moral are not always the same thing. No, they're not. Isabella sank into a chair, suddenly looking far older than her 24 years. Do you know what the worst part is? It's not just the slavery itself, though that's horrible enough. It's that my entire life has been a performance designed to hide this truth. Every charitable work I did, every kindness I showed to those less fortunate, every time I prided myself on being a good person, all of it was paid for with blood money. Your charity work was real, Blackwood said. Your kindness was genuine. The source of the money doesn't change the help you provided to those who needed it. Doesn't it? How many people might have been saved if I had discovered this earlier? How many families might have been kept together if I had found the courage to look past my comfortable assumptions? She pressed her palms against her eyes. I was so proud of my Miriam's legacy of compassion. But I never questioned whether our wealth was obtained compassionately. Blackwood knelt beside her chair, his voice gentle. You were raised to trust your father. That trust was betrayed, but the fault lies with him, not with you. I should have seen it. The signs were all there. The signs were carefully hidden by a man who had years of practice in deception. Edmund Hartwell is skilled at maintaining appearances while conducting his true business in shadows. Isabella lowered her hands and looked at the scattered documents with new eyes. What happens now? Do you plan to use this information somehow? That depends on you. On me. Blackwood stood, his expression serious. You're Edmund Hartwell's daughter and heir. Your testimony about his business practices could carry weight with authorities who have been looking for evidence of illegal trading activities. But providing that testimony would mean acknowledging publicly that your family's fortune was built on human suffering. The implications settled over Isabella like a heavy cloak. To expose her father would mean destroying everything she had known about her life, her family, her place in society. It would mean admitting that every luxury she had enjoyed, every opportunity she had been given, had come at the cost of other people's freedom and dignity. But it would also mean that her father's crimes would finally face justice. The authorities, she said slowly, they would need more than just my word, wouldn't they? They would need documentation, evidence, witness testimony. Blackwood gestured to the papers spread across his table, all of which exists aboard the ships of those who have opposed Hartwell's operations over the years. Ships like yours, among others, yes. Isabella stood and walked back to the porthole, staring out at the endless expanse of Caribbean blue. Somewhere out there, her father was continuing his business, buying and selling human lives while maintaining his respectable facade in London society. Somewhere out there, families were being torn apart to feed his greed. If I help you expose him, she said quietly, there's no going back, no returning to my old life, no pretending I never knew the truth. No, Blackwood agreed, there is. She turned to face him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears, but her voice steady, with newfound resolve. Then we'd better make sure we do it right. In that moment, Blackwood saw the true measure of the woman. Isabella Hartwell was becoming it, not the sheltered merchant's daughter who had been taken from her father's ship, but someone willing to sacrifice everything she had known in service of what was right. It was perhaps the most beautiful and terrible transformation he had ever witnessed. The marriage contract lay on the table between them, its parchment surface bearing elaborate calligraphy that proclaimed the union of Captain Thomas Blackwood and Miss Isabella Hartwell. The document was a masterwork of fiction, complete with false witnesses and a fabricated ceremony date, but it might be the only thing that could save Isabella's life. It won't fool anyone for long, Blackwood said, setting down his pen after signing his name with a flourish. But it might buy us enough time to reach Nassau and find passage for you to somewhere safe. Isabella studied the forged document with a mixture of admiration and trepidation. Where did you learn to create such convincing legal papers? A misspent youth includes many useful skills. I once forged Admiral Pembroke's signature well enough to requisition supplies for 3 months before anyone noticed. His smile was grim. The irony that I'm using those same skills to protect someone rather than deceive them isn't lost on me. The plan was desperate but necessary. Hendricks and his supporters had grown bolder in their opposition to Isabella's presence aboard the ship, and Torres had intercepted disturbing conversations about selling her to slave traders in Tortuga. A marriage, even a false one, would make her Blackwood's wife under maritime law and give him legal grounds to refuse any attempts to remove her from his protection. The ceremony will need to look legitimate, Isabella said, picking up the pen to add her own signature. If the crew suspects it's merely a performance, it won't serve its purpose. Old Murphy has performed marriages before. He served as chaplain aboard a privateer for 6 years and still remembers the proper words. As far as the crew will know, this is entirely legitimate. Isabella's hand hesitated over the document. Once she signed this paper, she would be declaring herself married to a pirate captain, bound to him by laws both maritime and civil. Even if the marriage was false, the implications were real enough. "Thomas," she said quietly, "what happens if we survive this deception? What happens when we no longer need the protection of a fraudulent marriage?" Blackwood's grey eyes met hers across the table. "Then we make whatever choices seem right at that time. I won't hold you to vows spoken under duress. Isabella, when you're safe, when the immediate danger has passed, you'll be free to choose your own path. And if I choose to stay..." The question hung between them like morning mist over calm water. Blackwood had been careful not to think too far ahead, not to imagine a future that might include the impossible luxury of companionship and love. But Isabella's quiet words forced him to confront possibilities he had been afraid to acknowledge. "Then we would face whatever challenges that choice brings," he said finally. "But I won't ask that of you. The life I can offer you is hard and dangerous, with no guarantee of safety or respectability." Isabella signed her name with steady strokes, then set down the pen. "The life my father offered me was built on the suffering of innocent people. Perhaps hard and dangerous is preferable to comfortable and corrupt." A knock at the cabin door interrupted their conversation. Torres entered at Blackwood's call, his weathered face carefully neutral as he took in the scene before him. "The crew is assembled on deck, Captain. Murphy is ready to perform the ceremony whenever you are. Any word from our dissatisfied shipmate?" Hendricks is keeping his thoughts to himself for now, but Jackson seems genuinely pleased by this turn of events. "Says a captain's wife deserves the crew's respect and protection." Torres paused. "I think most of the men would rather see you married than see Miss Isabella sold to slavery." Isabella stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor. She had found a clean dress among the supplies taken from various captured ships, a simple blue wool that fit her reasonably well. It wasn't the elaborate silk gown she had once imagined wearing for her wedding, but it would serve. "Shall we proceed with this charade, husband?" she asked, offering Blackwood her arm. "After you, wife," he replied, and despite the false nature of their union, the words sent an unexpected thrill through both of them. The ceremony that followed was brief but surprisingly moving. Murphy spoke the traditional words with genuine solemnity, and the crew watched with a mixture of curiosity and approval as their captain and his prisoner exchanged vows that were both meaningless and profound. When Blackwood kissed his new bride to seal their false marriage, the kiss was anything but false. Isabella responded with a passion that made several crew members whistle appreciatively, and for a moment both of them forgot that this was merely a performance designed to ensure her safety. "Ladies and gentlemen," Murphy announced with theatrical flair, "I present Captain and Mrs. Thomas Blackwood." The crew cheered, and even Hendricks managed a grudging smile as Isabella curtsied gracefully to acknowledge their approval. She had become one of them now, not just through her actions during the storm, but through marriage to their captain. Whatever her origins, she was family now. Later that evening, as Isabella prepared for sleep in what was now officially her marriage cabin, she found herself studying the ring Blackwood had placed on her finger during the ceremony. It was a simple band of gold, taken from some long-forgotten prize, but it felt heavy with significance. "Do you regret it?" Blackwood asked from where he was preparing his own bedroll on the cabin floor. "Which part? The false marriage or the real feelings it seems to represent?" "Either. Both." Isabella turned the ring on her finger, watching how it caught the lamplight. "I regret the deception it requires, but I don't regret being bound to you, even temporarily, even falsely. Is that foolish of me? If it is, then we're both fools." Blackwood blew out the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness lit only by moonlight through the portholes. "Sleep well, Miss Blackwood. Sleep well, husband." In the darkness, both of them lay awake, thinking about the strange turn their lives had taken, and wondering whether a marriage begun in deception might somehow transform into something genuine and lasting. The golden wedding ring caught the morning sunlight as Isabella worked alongside the crew to repair storm damage, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the unfamiliar weight on her finger. The band had belonged to someone else once, taken from a Spanish merchant vessel 2 years prior. But now it served as both shield and symbol, protecting her from those who would harm her while binding her to a man she was beginning to love. "Miss Blackwood," Billy Hawkins called out, using her new title with careful respect. "Could you help me with this rigging? These knots are giving me trouble." Isabella smiled at the young sailor and moved to assist him, their shoulders touching companionably as they worked to secure the damaged lines. The crew had accepted her marriage to their captain with surprising grace, and she found herself settling into the role of captain's wife with more ease than she had expected. "You've got good hands for this work," Billy observed, as Isabella deftly secured a complex knot. "My mother always said you could tell a person's character by how they handled held. And what does my rope handling tell you about my character? That you're not afraid of hard work, and you don't mind getting your hands dirty for the good of the ship." Billy grinned. Captain chose well. The easy acceptance warmed Isabella's heart, but it also made her acutely aware of the deception at the heart of her new status. These men respected her as their captain's wife, trusted her with their lives and their secrets. Yet the marriage itself was built on lies designed to protect her from other lies. Blackwood appeared at her elbow, his presence announcing itself through the familiar scent of sea salt and leather that seemed to cling to everything he owned. "How are the repairs progressing?" "Nearly finished, husband," Isabella replied, the words still feeling strange on her tongue. "Billy has been teaching me the finer points of maritime knotwork. Valuable skills for a captain's wife." Blackwood's eyes crinkled with what might have been amusement or genuine affection. "Perhaps you'd join me for the noon meal. There are some navigation charts I'd like your opinion on." The request was phrased as a suggestion, but Isabella recognized it as the command it actually was. Part of maintaining their deception required them to behave like a married couple, which meant spending time together, consulting each other on ship's business, and generally acting as if their union was both genuine and harmonious. They made their way to the cabin that was now officially theirs, though Blackwood continued to sleep on the floor out of respect for Isabella's modesty. The navigation charts were indeed spread across the table, but Isabella suspected they were merely a prop for a more complex conversation. "Torres brought some concerning news this morning," Blackwood said without preamble once the door was closed behind them. "There's been chatter among the crew about our marriage." Isabella's heart sank. "They suspect it's false." "Not exactly. But some of them are wondering about the sudden change in our relationship. Hendricks in particular is asking pointed questions about why a captive woman would willingly marry her captor." "And what have you told them?" "That affairs of the heart rarely follow logical pattern." Blackwood moved to stand near the porthole, his back to her, as he gazed out at the sea. "That sometimes two people find each other under the most unlikely circumstances and discover they're meant to be together." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond their practical purpose. Isabella studied the tension in his shoulders and realized that their pretense was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Not because it was unconvincing, but because it was becoming uncomfortably close to the truth. "Thomas," she said softly, "when you told them that, were you speaking about our performance or about something else?" He turned to face her, and Isabella saw vulnerability in his gray eyes that took her breath away. "I'm not sure I know the difference anymore." The admission cracked something open in Isabella's chest. She moved toward him without conscious thought, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, where she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through the linen of his shirt. "Neither do I," she whispered. This time when he kissed her, there was nothing false about it. No audience to convince, no deception to maintain, just two people acknowledging feelings that had grown beyond their ability to control or deny. Isabella melted into his embrace, her arms circling his neck as she rose up on her toes to meet him fully. The kiss deepened, became something urgent and desperate and real. Blackwood's hands tangled in her hair, loosening it from its careful arrangement, and Isabella didn't care. She had spent weeks pretending not to feel the attraction that sparked between them, weeks denying the growing affection that made her heart race whenever he entered a room. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Blackwood rested his forehead against hers, his hands still framing her face with surprising gentleness. "This complicates everything," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know if anyone discovers that our marriage began as a deception but has become something genuine, it could undermine everything we've tried to accomplish. I know that too. And yet I can't bring myself to regret it." His thumb traced along her cheekbone with reverent care. "Whatever brought you into my life, whether fate or circumstance or simple chance, I'm grateful for it." Isabella reached up to cover his hand with her own. "Even though loving me could cost you everything, your ship, your crew, your freedom, especially then. What's the point of freedom if you have no one to share it with? What's the value of loyalty that's built on fear rather than affection?" A knock at the cabin door interrupted them, and they sprang apart like guilty children. Taurus' voice called through the wood, reporting sail on the horizon that required the captain's attention. "Duty calls," Blackwood said, straightening his shirt and attempting to restore some semblance of composure. As always, Isabella moved to the small mirror mounted on the cabin wall, trying to repair her disheveled hair. "Thomas?" "Yes? Tonight, when we're alone again, let's talk about what happens next, about what we want this marriage to become, deception or not." Blackwood paused with his hand on the door handle. "And if what we want is impossible, if the circumstances of our lives make happiness nothing more than a beautiful dream?" Isabella met his eyes in the mirror's reflection. "Then at least we'll have been honest about the dreamer." As Blackwood left to attend to his duties, Isabella remained in the cabin, staring at the wedding ring that no longer felt like a costume piece, but like a promise she was finally ready to make in earnest. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face together or apart, she knew that their false marriage had given birth to something genuine and precious. Now she had to find the courage to fight for it. The tarnished medal lay heavy in Tora's palm, its bronze surface etched with the coat of arms of the Spanish Navy, and the words, "Honor yet patria," barely visible after years of wear. He had earned it for valor during a battle against French privateers 15 years ago, back when he still believed that honor and country were causes worth bleeding for. Now, as he prepared to betray the man he had followed through hell and back, the medal felt like lead against his weathered skin. "The message has been sent," he said quietly to the figure waiting in the shadows of the cargo hold. "Edmund Hartwell knows his daughter's location and the composition of our crew." The man who stepped forward was unremarkable in appearance. Average height, thinning hair, clothes that marked him as a merchant sailor rather than a pirate, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who traded in information as readily as others traded in rum or tobacco. "And the payment?" the informant asked. Torres reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch filled with gold coins. "As a groom, though, I hope you understand the consequences if word of this arrangement reaches Captain Blackwood before our business is concluded." "I understand perfectly." Mr. Hartwell was very clear about the need for discretion. The informant pocketed the gold, without counting it. "The merchant lord should receive word within the week. His response will depend on how quickly he can arrange naval support for the rescue operation." After the informant melted back into the shadows of the ship's bowels, Torres remained in the cargo hold, staring at the medal in his palm. The decision to betray Blackwood had not come easily. For 10 years he had followed the man through battles and storms, sharing dangers and victories in equal measure. But watching his captain's growing attachment to Isabella Hartwell had convinced Torres that drastic action was necessary. Blackwood was changing, becoming softer and more vulnerable with each passing day. The hard-edged pragmatist, who had survived betrayal and built himself into a legend, was being replaced by someone who cared more about a woman's comfort than his crew's safety. Torres had seen what happened to leaders who let personal feelings compromise their judgment, and he refused to watch it happen again. The sound of footsteps on the deck above reminded him that the ship's routine continued unchanged. Isabella was probably working alongside the crew as had become her habit, earning their respect through actions rather than words. Blackwood would be at the wheel or studying his charts, making the countless small decisions that kept them all alive and profitable. Neither of them suspected that their careful deception was about to be exposed by the one man they trusted most. Torres climbed the ladder to the main deck, his injured leg protesting with each rung. The afternoon sun painted the Caribbean waters gold and blue, and a steady wind filled their sails with the promise of fair weather ahead. Under different circumstances, it would have been a perfect day for sailing. Billy Hawkins called out from where he was coiling rope near the mainmast. Mrs. Blackwood was asking about those navigation instruments she wanted to learn about. Should I fetch them from the chart room? Tell her I'll bring them myself shortly, Torres replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. The boys' easy acceptance of Isabella's presence among them was typical of the crew's attitude. Most of the men had come to respect her courage and work ethic, seeing her as a valuable addition to their shipboard family rather than a burden or distraction. It was precisely that acceptance that made Torres' betrayal necessary. The crew's loyalty to Isabella was undermining their loyalty to their captain's judgment, creating dangerous divisions that could destroy them all when crisis came. Torres made his way to Blackwood's cabin, where he found his captain and Isabella bent over a collection of charts spread across the table. They stood close together, their shoulders touching as they traced shipping routes with their fingers, and the intimacy of the scene struck Torres like a physical blow. The supply situation in Port Royal has improved, Isabella was saying, her finger indicating a harbor on the Jamaica coast. According to these reports, the governor has lifted restrictions on provisioning private vessels, which means merchant traffic will increase through these waters. Blackwood replied, his hand covering hers briefly as he pointed to another location. More opportunities for profitable encounters. They looked up when Torres entered, and he saw something in their faces that confirmed his worst fears. The marriage that had begun as a tactical deception had evolved into something genuine and deep. Blackwood looked at Isabella with the expression of a man who had found something precious beyond measure, while she regarded him with the trust and affection of a woman truly in love. Torres, Blackwood smiled, apparently oblivious to his first mate's inner turmoil. Perfect timing. Isabella was just helping me plan our next course. Her knowledge of merchant shipping patterns has been invaluable. I'm sure it has, Torres replied carefully. Captain, there's a matter we need to discuss. Perhaps Mrs. Blackwood could excuse. Isabella glanced between the two men, sensing undercurrents she couldn't identify. Of course. I should check on how Peterson is recovering from his injuries anyway. After she left, Blackwood studied his first mate's face with growing concern. What's troubling you, old friend? You look like a man carrying the weight of the world. I'm carrying the weight of 10 years of loyalty, Torres said quietly, and wondering if it's finally become a burden I can no longer bear. What do you mean? Torres fingered the medal in his pocket, drawing strength from its familiar weight. I mean that I've watched you become someone I barely recognize. The Thomas Blackwood, who took command of this crew after the Navy betrayed us, would never have allowed personal feelings to compromise his judgment. Isabella hasn't compromised my judgment, hasn't she? When was the last time we took a significant prize? When was the last time you made a decision based solely on what was best for this crew, rather than what would keep your wife safe and comfortable? The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from a cannon blast. Blackwood's expression shifted from concern to something harder and more dangerous. Careful, Torres. You're treading on ground that could cost you more than you're prepared to lose. Am I the only one brave enough to point out that our legendary captain has been tamed by a pair of green eyes and a pretty smile? For a moment, Torres thought Blackwood might strike him. The captain's hands clenched into fists, and his grey eyes flashed with the cold fury that had made him feared throughout the Caribbean. But then something in his expression shifted, became calculating rather than merely angry. "What have you done?" Blackwood asked quietly. Torres met his captain's gaze steadily, knowing that the next words would end their friendship forever, but believing they were necessary for the greater good. "What I had to do," he said, "what you were too besotted to do yourself." The medal felt heavier than ever in his pocket, a reminder of oaths broken and loyalties betrayed in service of a greater loyalty that only he seemed to understand. The Naval Commission bore Edmund Hartwell's name in gold script across parchment that still smelled of sealing wax and authority. The document, signed by the Admiralty itself, granted him special powers to pursue pirates who had threatened British shipping interests, powers that included commandeering naval vessels and pressing merchant sailors into temporary service. It was a remarkable piece of paper for a man who had never served a day in His Majesty's Navy, but gold had a way of opening doors that merit alone could not. Hartwell stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Retribution, watching the Caribbean horizon through his spyglass as 3 ships of the line maintained formation around his flagship. The irony of commanding the very frigate where Thomas Blackwood had once served as lieutenant commander was not lost on him. The ship had been refitted and recommissioned twice since the massacre that had ended Blackwood's naval career, but her bones remained the same. "Sir," Captain Morrison approached with the measured deference of a career officer, addressing a civilian who nonetheless held considerable political influence. "The lookouts report no sign of the pirate vessel. Are you certain your intelligence regarding their position is accurate?" Hartwell lowered his spyglass and turned to face the captain. Morrison was a competent officer, but he lacked the imagination necessary to understand the complexities of the current situation. To him, this was simply a rescue mission complicated by the presence of dangerous criminals. "My sources have proven reliable in the past, Captain. The Crimson Tide will be found in these waters, and when she is, I expect your men to be prepared for immediate action." "Of course, sir. Though I must ask again about the specific instructions regarding your daughter. Standard protocol would be to negotiate for her release before engaging in combat." "There will be no negotiation," Hartwell said firmly. "Captain Blackwood has proven himself beyond redemption through his treatment of a defenseless woman. When we encounter his vessel, you will offer him one opportunity to surrender unconditionally. If he refuses, you will take the ship by force." Sir Morrison's expression suggested he found these orders troubling but was unwilling to question them directly. "And if Miss Hartwell is harmed during the engagement?" "My daughter is remarkably resilient, Captain. I'm confident she will survive whatever unpleasantness may be necessary to secure her freedom." The conversation was interrupted by a shout from the crow's nest. "Sail 3 points off the starboard bow." Hartwell raised his spyglass again, scanning the horizon until he found the distant ship. Even at this distance, he could make out the distinctive lines of the Crimson Tide, her black sails billowing in the afternoon breeze like wings of some predatory bird. "That's her," he said with grim satisfaction. "Signal the fleet to close formation and prepare for engagement." As the naval vessels adjusted their course to intercept the pirate ship, Hartwell allowed himself a moment of private reflection. The past months had been among the most challenging of his considerable career. Isabella's disappearance had created exactly the kind of scandal he had spent years trying to avoid, while parliamentary inquiries into certain trading practices had made his London life increasingly uncomfortable. But all of that would be resolved once his daughter was safely returned, and Thomas Blackwood was hanging from a gibbet in Port Royal. The pirate's death would serve as both vengeance for past insults and a warning to others who might consider interfering with Hartwell's business interests. Hartwell Morrison called from where he stood conferring with his officers. "The pirate vessel has spotted us and appears to be altering course. Should we pursue?" "By all means, Captain. I'm eager to conclude this business." The chase that followed was a masterclass in naval tactics, with Blackwood attempting to use his superior knowledge of local waters to evade the heavier but slower warships. For nearly 2 hours, the Crimson Tide led her pursuers through a maze of coral reefs and shallow passages that would have grounded any vessel with a deeper draft. But Hartwell's fleet included local pilots familiar with these same waters, and gradually the net began to close. When the pirate ship finally emerged into open water, she found herself facing 3 ships of the line arranged in a perfect triangle that blocked every avenue of escape. "Signal them to heave to," Hartwell ordered, "and prepare a boarding party." The response came not in the form of signal flags, but as a cannon shot that splashed harmlessly into the water 50 yards from the Retribution's bow. A moment later, signal flags appeared on the Crimson Tide's rigging, spelling out a message that made Morrison's eyebrows rise. "What do they say?" Hartwell demanded. "They're requesting parley, sir. Standard maritime protocol would require us to at least hear their terms." "There will be no parley. Open fire." Morrison hesitated. "Sir, with respect, your daughter is aboard that vessel. Naval regulations require—" "Naval regulations are subordinate to my commission, Captain. You will fire on that ship immediately, or I will find an officer who will." The threat carried enough weight to overcome Morrison's reluctance. The first broadside from HMS Retribution sent 24-pound balls crashing into the Crimson Tide's hull, splintering wood and sending debris flying across her deck. Through his spyglass, Hartwell could see figures running for cover as more cannon fire erupted from the surrounding ships. Smoke began to rise from the pirate vessel's stern, suggesting that at least one shot had started a fire below decks. But instead of surrendering, the Crimson Tide returned fire with surprising accuracy, her lighter guns targeting the Retribution's rigging in an attempt to disable the larger ship's maneuverability. One shot actually struck the mainmast just above Hartwell's head, showering him with splinters and reminding him that this was real combat rather than the civilized business negotiations he was accustomed to. "Sir," a midshipman called out over the roar of cannon fire, "there's movement on the pirate vessel's deck. It looks like they're launching boats." Hartwell focused his spyglass on the Crimson Tide's stern and saw 2 small boats pulling away from the burning ship, their occupants pulling desperately at the oars as cannonballs splashed around them. "They're abandoning ship," he said with satisfaction. "Captain Morrison, have your Marines ready to take prisoners. I want every soul aboard that vessel accounted for, especially my daughter." But as the battle continued and the Crimson Tide began to list badly to starboard, Hartwell realized that his carefully laid plans were about to become far more complicated than he had anticipated. The commission in his pocket had given him the authority to wage war against pirates, but it could not guarantee that Isabella would survive the violence he had unleashed to reclaim her. The sword had belonged to Blackwood's father, Admiral Sir William Blackwood, and its steel had tasted blood in battles from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The blade bore the family crest etched into the fuller, a ship's anchor crossed with a rose, symbolizing duty tempered by compassion. Now, as cannon fire shattered the morning air and the Crimson Tide shuddered under the impact of naval artillery, Thomas drew his father's sword for what might be the last time. "All hands on deck," he bellowed over the roar of battle, his voice carrying the authority of 10 years commanding desperate men in desperate situations. "Prepare to repel boarders." The deck around him was chaos incarnate. Splinters flew like deadly rain as 24-pound shot crashed through the ship's hull. The mainmast had taken a direct hit and swayed dangerously overhead, held upright by rigging that groaned with each impact. Smoke poured from the stern where incendiary shot had started fires that the crew was struggling to contain. Isabella appeared at his side, her face streaked with soot and her dress torn from helping carry ammunition to the gun crews. In her hands she held a cutlass taken from the ship's armory, its blade reflecting the orange glow of fires burning throughout the ship. "The port guns are nearly out of ammunition," she reported with the calm efficiency of someone who had learned to function under fire. "Peterson says we have maybe 6 shots left, then we'll have to make them count." Blackwood caught sight of Torres across the smoke-filled deck, directing the crew's efforts to fight the fires, threatening to consume their ship. Despite his betrayal, the first mate was still fighting for their survival with the dedication that had defined their partnership for 10 years. Isabella grabbed his arm as another broadside crashed into their hull. "The boat they launched, I saw Torres getting into it. He's trying to reach my father's ship." The confirmation of Torres' treachery should have filled Blackwood with rage, but instead he felt only a cold certainty about what needed to be done. He thinks he's saving us from my poor judgment. He doesn't understand that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. Are we worth fighting for? This marriage, this life we've built together, even if it destroys everything else you've worked for? Blackwood looked into her eyes and saw reflected the same fierce determination that had driven her to save Peterson during the storm. The same courage that had led her to denounce her father's crimes, despite the personal cost. This woman had transformed from pampered aristocrat to warrior in the span of weeks, and her transformation had awakened something in him that he had thought permanently lost. "You are worth fighting for," he said simply, "even if it costs me everything." A tremendous crash interrupted their conversation as the mizzen mast, severed by naval gunfire, toppled across the deck. The falling timber crushed two of the starboard guns and pinned young Billy Hawkins beneath its weight. Isabella and Blackwood rushed to help free the boy, their hands working together to lift the heavy beam while other crew members pulled him clear. "My leg," Billy gasped, his face white with pain. "I can't feel my leg." Isabella tore strips from her petticoat to bind the boy's wounds, while Blackwood assessed their rapidly deteriorating situation. The Crimson Tide was taking on water faster than the pumps could handle it, and the naval vessels were closing in for the kill. He had perhaps 10 minutes before his ship would be boarded or sunk. "Captain," Peterson called out from the bow, "one of the Navy ships is coming alongside. They're preparing boarding parties." Through the smoke, Blackwood could see HMS Retribution's massive bulk sliding up to match their course. Grappling hooks flew across the gap between the ships, and Marines in red coats prepared to swarm aboard his vessel. "Isabella," he said urgently, "get below decks. Find somewhere to hide until this is over." "No." She stood beside him, cutlass raised, her green eyes blazing with determination. "I won't cower while you fight for our freedom. If we're going down, we go down together." The first wave of Marines came over the rail like a red tide, their muskets and cutlasses gleaming in the smoky air. Blackwood met them with his father's sword, the familiar weight of the weapon guiding his movements as he cut through their ranks with the skill of someone who had learned to fight for survival rather than sport. Isabella proved equally deadly, with her borrowed cutlass, her smaller size allowing her to dart between opponents, while her shipboard training gave her the balance to fight effectively on the tilting deck. She and Blackwood moved together as if they had been fighting side by side for years, covering each other's weaknesses and amplifying each other's strengths. But courage and skill could not overcome overwhelming numbers. More Marines poured over the rail with each passing moment, and the surviving crew of the Crimson Tide found themselves pushed back toward the stern of their dying ship. "Surrender, Blackwood." The voice belonged to Edmund Hartwell, who had apparently joined the boarding party to witness his enemy's defeat personally. "You're beaten. Give up now and I might be merciful." Blackwood looked at the merchant lord standing safely behind a wall of Marines and felt his lips curve in a predatory smile. "Mercy from you, Hartwell? I'd rather take my chances with the devil. Then you'll have that opportunity shortly. But first, I believe you have something that belongs to me." Isabella stepped forward, her cutlass still raised despite the hopelessness of their position. "I belong to no one, father, least of all to you." Hartwell's expression darkened as he took in his daughter's appearance, her torn dress, her weapon, the way she stood protectively beside the pirate captain. "Isabella, you don't understand what this man has done to you, the lies he's told, the way he's corrupted your thinking. But that can be corrected once we're home. This is my home now, these people are my family, and Thomas is my husband in every way that matters." "Husband?" Hartwell's laugh was harsh and contemptuous. "You married this criminal, this murderer and thief?" "I married the most honorable man I've ever known, which is more than I can say about my father." The words struck Hartwell like a physical blow, and his face flushed with rage and humiliation. "Seize them both," he ordered the Marines. "Use whatever force is necessary." But as the soldiers moved forward, a new voice cut through the chaos, Torres climbing back aboard from the boat he had used to reach the naval vessels. "Wait," the first mate called out, his weathered face grim with purpose. There's something you need to know about Edmund Hartwell before this goes any further. The confession lay crumpled in Torres' weathered fist, its parchment bearing Edmund Hartwell's own handwriting and signature. A detailed admission of his involvement in illegal slave trading, bribing naval officers, and falsifying shipping manifests to avoid customs duties. The document had been obtained at sword point during Torres' desperate gambit to save his captain and crew, but it might be the key to their survival. "Read it aloud," Torres commanded, pressing his cutlass against Hartwell's throat hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. "Every word, so these naval officers can hear exactly what kind of man they're serving." Captain Morrison of HMS Retribution stepped forward, his face grave with concern. "Mr. Hartwell, what is the meaning of this? What document is he referring to?" Hartwell's eyes darted between Torres' blade and the crowd of Marines and sailors surrounding them on the smoke-filled deck. "It's nothing, Captain. The ravings of a desperate pirate trying to save his own neck. You can't possibly take seriously anything written under duress." "Can't we?" Torres' smile was cold as winter seas. "Tell me, Captain Morrison, are you familiar with the recent parliamentary investigations into certain shipping companies? The ones looking into illegal trafficking of human cargo?" Morrison's expression grew troubled. "I am. The Admiralty has been cooperating with those inquiries." His eyes fixed on Hartwell with new suspicion. "Are you suggesting that Mr. Hartwell is connected to those investigations?" "I'm suggesting that your Mr. Hartwell is the primary target of those investigations." Torres held up the confession so the naval officers could see the merchant lord's distinctive handwriting. "This document details 20 years of systematic violations of British law, including the transportation of enslaved persons in violation of the Abolition Act." A murmur ran through the assembled Marines as they began to understand the implications of what they were hearing. Several officers exchanged meaningful glances, and Captain Morrison's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt. "That's impossible," Morrison said slowly. "Mr. Hartwell holds a commission from the Admiralty itself. He's been granted authority to pursue pirates, threatening British shipping. Authority purchased with gold stolen from the very people he's enslaved," Isabella said, stepping forward despite the weapons still pointed at her. "Father, tell them the truth. Tell them about the ships you've sent to Africa, about the human cargo you've transported to sugar plantations throughout the Caribbean." Hartwell's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "These are the lies of criminals trying to escape justice, Captain. My daughter has obviously been brainwashed by these pirates into believing their propaganda." "Have I?" Isabella's laugh held no humor. "Then explain this." She reached into her bodice and withdrew a folded paper, one of the shipping manifests Torres had shown her weeks ago aboard the Crimson Tide. The document bore her father's signature and detailed the transportation of 200 units of human merchandise from the Gold Coast to Jamaica. "This is your handwriting, Father. Your signature. Your seal." Isabella held the manifest where the naval officers could see it clearly. "This is proof of your crimes, written in your own hand." Captain Morrison studied the document with growing alarm. As a career naval officer, he was familiar with shipping manifests and could recognize their authenticity. More importantly, he was beginning to remember certain rumors that had circulated through the officers' mess in recent months. Whispers about merchants who use their political connections to avoid scrutiny of their cargo. "Miss Hartwell," Morrison said carefully, "I think you need to explain these documents. If there's any truth to these allegations, the only truth here is that I'm the victim of an elaborate conspiracy." Hartwell replied, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "These pirates have obviously forged these documents as part of their scheme to avoid punishment." "Have they?" Torres reached into his coat and withdrew another paper, this one bearing the official seal of the Admiralty. "Then perhaps you can explain why your name appears on this list of merchants currently under investigation for violations of maritime law." The document was genuine, and Morrison recognized it immediately. His face hardened as he realized he had been manipulated into providing military support for a man who was likely a criminal himself. "Marines," Morrison commanded, "lower your weapons and step back." Captain, what are you doing?" Hartwell demanded. "These are dangerous pirates. They've kidnapped my daughter and—" "Have they kidnapped her?" Morrison interrupted. "Because she seems remarkably free for a captive. In fact, she seems to be defending them rather than seeking rescue." Isabella moved to stand beside Blackwood, her hand finding his despite the weapons surrounding them. "Because they're not my captors, Captain Morrison. They're my family, my husband." She held up her left hand, showing the simple gold band that marked her as a married woman. "I chose to join them, chose to leave behind a life built on the suffering of innocent people." "Preposterous," Hartwell sputtered. "She's clearly been coerced, possibly even drugged. You can't take seriously the claims of a woman who's obviously not in her right mind." But Morrison was studying Isabella's face with the eye of someone trained to read people under stress. And what he saw there was not the confusion of a victim, but the clear-eyed determination of someone who had made difficult choices and was prepared to defend them. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, using her married name deliberately, "are you aboard this vessel against your will?" "I am not. I chose to marry Captain Blackwood after learning the truth about my father's business practices. I chose to help expose his crimes rather than benefit from them any longer." "Captain Morrison," Hartwell's voice carried a note of desperation now. "Surely you're not going to take the word of pirates over that of a respected British merchant." "Respected?" Morrison's voice was cold. "Miss Hartwell, if these documents are genuine and my preliminary examination suggests they are, then you are no merchant, but a criminal who has used his wealth to avoid justice for decades." Torres pressed his advantage. "There's more, Captain. Miss Hartwell didn't just transport enslaved people illegally. He sold information about British naval patrols to French privateers. He's the reason HMS Retribution suffered such heavy casualties 20 years ago. He's the reason Thomas Blackwood was framed for crimes he never committed." The revelation hit Morrison like a physical blow. HMS Retribution had been his first command, and he had lost good men in the battle that Torres was describing. "If Hartwell had been responsible for that tragedy, you have no proof of that," Hartwell said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Don't I?" Torres smiled grimly and reached for another document. "This is a letter in your handwriting, addressed to Admiral Pembroke, detailing British fleet movements in exchange for gold. It was found among Pembroke's papers after his death." As Torres revealed document after document, each one more damning than the last, Captain Morrison's expression grew increasingly grim. The man he had been ordered to support was not just a criminal, but a traitor who had sold British secrets to enemy forces. "Marines," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades at sea. "Arrest Edmund Hartwell on charges of treason, illegal trafficking, and conspiracy against the Crown." The soldiers who had been preparing to capture pirates now turned their weapons on the man who had brought them here. Hartwell backed away, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. "You can't do this. I have a commission from the Admiralty. I have connections in Parliament." "Had," Morrison corrected. "I suspect those connections will prove rather fragile once these documents reach the proper authorities." As the Marines closed in on him, Hartwell's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled, revealing the desperate criminal underneath. The tailored coat had been cut from sailcloth by the ship's sailmaker, dyed deep blue with indigo, traded from a merchant vessel, and fitted with brass buttons salvaged from a naval uniform. It wasn't the silk and velvet that Isabella had once worn in London drawing rooms, but as she stood on the quarter-deck of their renamed vessel 6 months after the battle with her father's fleet, she had never felt more regal or more at home. "Captain on deck," Billy Hawkins called out as Blackwood emerged from the chart room, his own coat bearing the gold braid that marked him as master of the vessel now christened Isabella's Promise. The young sailor's leg had healed well after being crushed during the battle, leaving him with only a slight limp and an even greater devotion to the woman who had helped save his life. Isabella turned from where she had been instructing new crew members in the art of reading weather signs, her captain's coat catching the morning sunlight as she moved. The past months had transformed her from the sheltered merchant's daughter who had first been brought aboard the Crimson Tide into someone who commanded respect through knowledge and deed rather than birthright. "The morning reports, Captain Blackwood," she said formally, though her eyes sparkled with private humor at the title. They had agreed to share command of their vessel, with Blackwood handling navigation and tactics, while Isabella managed supplies, crew welfare, and their new mission of hunting slavers and corrupt merchants. "Thank you, Captain Blackwood," Thomas replied with equal formality, accepting the leather portfolio she offered. Their partnership had evolved naturally from the desperate circumstances of their early relationship into something approaching a perfect balance of skills and temperaments. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Several of the original crew members had chosen to leave when it became clear that their new mission would be less profitable than traditional piracy. Hendricks had departed in Port Royal, taking with him a small group of men who preferred the certainty of plunder to the uncertainty of justice. But others had stayed, drawn by the promise of purpose beyond mere survival. Peterson had become their expert on slave ship construction, able to identify vessels involved in human trafficking by the telltale modifications needed to transport human cargo. Murphy had proven surprisingly skilled at forging documents that would grant them access to ports controlled by corrupt officials. And Torres, despite his earlier betrayal, had requested permission to remain with the crew after Hartwell's arrest. His knowledge of naval tactics and merchant shipping routes had proven invaluable in their new role as hunters rather than hunted. The intelligence from Nassau confirms 3 slaving vessels operating out of Tortuga, Isabella reported as they reviewed the morning's correspondence. The Bloody Mary, Devil's Bargain, and Merchant's Pride, all flying false British flags to avoid inspection by naval patrols. Crew size and armament, Thomas asked, already calculating the tactical challenges they would face. Between 40 and 60 men each, armed with 12-pounders and small arms. They're expecting to be challenged by pirates, seeking plunder, not by former pirates seeking justice. It was the advantage that had served them well in their previous encounters. Slave ship captains expected to face criminals motivated by greed, not idealists willing to risk everything for principle. The confusion had allowed Isabella's promise to liberate over 300 enslaved people in the past 6 months, delivering them to communities of free blacks in Jamaica and the Bahamas, where they could begin new lives. "There's also this," Isabella said, producing a letter bearing an official seal. Captain Morrison, the naval officer who had arrested Edmund Hartwell, had become an unexpected ally in their mission. Morrison's investigation into Hartwell's crimes had revealed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of colonial administration, and he had quietly begun providing intelligence about ships and routes involved in illegal trading. "What does he say?" Thomas asked. "Hartwell's trial is set for next month in London. Morrison thinks there's a good chance of conviction, especially with the evidence we provided." Isabella paused, her expression growing complex. "He also says that if I testified in person, it would virtually guarantee my father's conviction." The possibility had been discussed before, but never seriously. Returning to London would mean abandoning their mission, at least temporarily, and facing the society that had once celebrated Isabella as the daughter of a respected merchant. Now she would be known as the pirate captain who had exposed her own father's crimes. "Do you want to go?" Thomas asked gently. Isabella looked out over the deck where their crew was preparing for another day's hunting of slave ships. These men and women had become her family in ways that transcended blood relationships, united by shared purpose and mutual respect rather than mere circumstance of birth. "I want to see justice done," she said finally, "but not at the cost of abandoning the work we're doing here. Morrison has enough evidence to convict my father without my testimony. Our testimony is needed here, in freeing people who have no other advocates." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her decision. "Then we continue as planned. The Devil's Bargain leaves port tomorrow with a cargo of 200 souls bound for the sugar plantations. If we can intercept her before she reaches open water, we can free them all," Isabella finished, "and send another message to slavers that these waters are no longer safe for their trade." They spent the rest of the morning planning their attack, their heads bent together over charts and manifests like the partners in both marriage and mission they had become. Around them, the crew prepared for battle with the quiet efficiency of people who had found something worth fighting for. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Isabella touched the brass buttons on her sailcloth coat and marveled at how completely her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a pampered aristocrat, living on the proceeds of human misery. Now she was a pirate captain dedicated to ending that same misery, and she had never been happier. The coat might be made of sailcloth rather than silk, but it represented something far more valuable than mere luxury. It represented freedom, both her own and that of the people she had sworn to protect. And as Isabella's promise set course for their next encounter with the forces of injustice, Isabella knew she had finally found her true calling. The brass nameplate gleamed in the setting sun, its polished surface reflecting the golden light as it proclaimed to the world that this vessel was Isabella's promise, no longer the crimson tide of Thomas Blackwood's dark years, but something new and hopeful. The plate had been crafted by a freed blacksmith in Nassau, a man whose own chains had been broken by the crew of this very ship, and he had refused all payment save the promise that they would continue their work. Isabella stood at the bow rail, her hands resting on the smooth wood, as she watched the Caribbean sun sink toward the horizon in a blaze of orange and crimson. The day's work was done. Another slaving vessel intercepted, another 100 souls freed to choose their own destinies. In the 6 months since her father's downfall, she had learned to measure success not in gold acquired, but in lives liberated. "Regrets?" Thomas asked, moving to stand beside her. Even after all this time, his presence still sent a thrill through her, though the desperate urgency of their early relationship had mellowed into something deeper and more sustaining. About which part? Leaving behind silk gowns for sailcloth coats, trading drawing-room conversations for battle plans, choosing love over duty to a corrupt father. All of it, any of it. His hand found hers on the rail, their fingers intertwining with the practiced ease of two people who had learned to move as one. "You could have had a different life, Isabella. Comfortable, respectable, safe." She turned to face him fully, studying the weathered features that had become more precious to her than any treasure they had ever captured. The scars of his past were still there, the thin line along his jaw, the deeper mark that disappeared into his hairline, but they no longer spoke only of pain and betrayal. Now they told the story of a man who had found his way back to honor through love. Could I really have lived comfortably knowing that my comfort came at the cost of other people's freedom? Could I have been respectable while benefiting from my father's crimes? Could I have been safe while innocent people suffered in chains? Most people manage it. Then perhaps most people are stronger than I am. Or perhaps they're simply better at lying to themselves. Isabella smiled, the expression carrying both sadness and profound contentment. "I tried to be that person, Tom. For 24 years, I tried to be the dutiful daughter who didn't ask uncomfortable questions about the source of her family's wealth. It nearly destroyed my soul." Around them, the crew was settling into the evening routine that had become as familiar as breathing. Peterson was teaching navigation to the newest recruits, 3 young men they had freed from a slave ship bound for Barbados, who had chosen to join their mission rather than seek passage to distant homes. Murphy was leading the evening prayers that had become a tradition aboard their ship, thanking whatever gods might listen for their safety and success. Torres approached from the stern, his weathered face bearing the satisfaction of a man who had found redemption in service to a cause greater than himself. "The Devil's Bargain has been scuttled, Captain. Her crew has been put ashore at Grand Cayman with enough supplies to reach Nassau if they choose to reform their ways." "And her former cargo?" Isabella asked, safely aboard 3 different merchant vessels bound for free ports in Jamaica and the Bahamas. "They'll have the chance to build new lives, far from the plantations that would have claimed them. It was their standard practice: destroy the slave ships that transported human cargo, scatter their crews with warnings about the consequences of continuing their trade, and ensure that their victims reached safety among communities of free blacks who could help them begin again." "How many does that make this month?" Thomas asked. 7 ships, over 400 people freed. Torres's smile was grim with satisfaction. Word is spreading through the slaving port. Captains are demanding higher pay to sail these waters, and some are refusing the runs entirely. It was progress, slow and hard-won, but real nonetheless. Each ship they took, each life they freed, each slaver they discouraged from continuing his trade was a small victory against an institution that had caused immeasurable suffering. Isabella knew they could not end slavery with a single ship and a small crew, but they could make their corner of the world a little more just. There's something else, Torres continued. A message from Captain Morris. Edmund Hartwell has been convicted and sentenced to transportation to the penal colonies. His trading empire is being dismantled, and several other merchants have been arrested based on evidence found in his papers. Isabella absorbed this news with complex emotion. Justice had been done. Her father would face consequences for his crimes, but it gave her no satisfaction to think of the man who had raised her spending his remaining years in chains. Still, it was better than allowing him to continue destroying lives for profit. And the parliamentary investigations, Thomas asked. Proceeding. Morrison thinks the scandal will lead to stronger enforcement of the Abolition Act, maybe even expanded restrictions on the slave trade. Torres paused, studying Isabella's face carefully. He also says there's been talk of offering pardons to certain pirates who have been working against the slavers. Apparently, some people in London consider what we're doing to be patriotic duty rather than piracy. The possibility of legal pardons was something Isabella had barely dared to hope for. To continue their mission without the constant threat of arrest, to operate openly rather than in the shadows, to perhaps even receive official support for their work. It seemed almost too good to be true. "Would you want that?" she asked, Thomas quietly. "Official recognition? A return to respectability?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the careful thought it deserved. 6 months ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. The chance to clear my name, to be remembered as something other than a pirate and traitor. But now I think I'd rather be known as the pirate captain who chose justice over profit, who found love in the most unlikely places, and who learned what a woman's kiss truly tastes like. His thumb traced across her wedding ring, no longer the borrowed band from their false marriage, but a new one, crafted from gold willingly given by those they had helped. "It tastes like freedom, Isabella, like coming home to a purpose worth fighting for." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Isabella's promise sailed on through Caribbean waters that were slowly becoming safer for the innocent and more dangerous for those who would exploit them. Behind them lay the wreckage of another slave ship and the gratitude of another 100 freed souls. Ahead lay whatever challenges tomorrow would bring, faced by two people who had found in each other the strength to fight for something larger than themselves. The brass nameplate continued to gleam in the starlight, a promise kept and renewed with each passing day.